Hey, how you doing? In 1927 in Dallas is when 7-Eleven started. It used to be called Totem, and mini-marts became huge during the 50s and 60s. They really became popular. So it turns out I worked at a mini-mart in the 70s. I was in high school, of course, but my high school had a program, like a co-op program, they called it. So you could go to school a half a day and work a half day as long as you had a job. And this was before I was 16, so let's just say I was like 15 or something. And you could get a work permit from your school district. And of course, you needed that work permit to become part of this program called co-op. So that was fine with me because that was a half a day of school. I didn't have to go and make money at the same time with this job at the mini-mart. Now, it didn't matter what days of the week you worked. Your school still said, all right, you go to school, you start, say, at 8 o'clock, whatever, and you go till noon. Because most of the 2 last years that I was in high school, I didn't even stay there for lunch. So it was before lunchtime, so let's just say noon. And I got this job at the mini-mart. Now, I was making like maybe $2.50 an hour. So I did that certainly through the winter and into the spring until caddy season started. Of course, I was going to caddy during the summer. On weekends were the big times for caddies. So it didn't matter if I worked at the mini-mart during the week, but on weekends, I sort of saved those days for caddying because I made more money as a caddy. So at that job, especially on Sundays, I would work Sunday morning sometimes during the winter. And you would bring in the newspapers. A lot of papers came on Sunday. Everybody was buying the Sunday newspaper. And they would come in these bands. Like I would open the store, but before I would open it, the trucks would come by and deliver these newspapers. They would sit them by the front door. But they had these plastic bands on them. They were huge stacks of papers. We sold a lot of newspapers. So you would cut those bands off, take them inside the store and put them on the bottom shelf of what was like a news rack. Because that news rack, we also sold magazines there at the store. Magazines were huge. We sold a lot of those. And even maps, like road maps, because people would stop at a convenience store if they needed a map. Now you could get maps at gas stations and stuff too, but we sold a fair amount of maps too. And then another thing with Sundays, during the winter times of the year, a lot of people from the neighborhood would stop there to get their paper and a cup of coffee. So I always had 2 pots of coffee on at the mini-mart also. But the people would just hang out there after they got their newspaper and their coffee. Like the one older guy that ran a garage, he was always there. He had a local garage that was a couple blocks from the mini-mart. And this was the only mini-mart in this area. It's not like today where I can go down a road and see like 3 or 4 mini-marts in a row, like from one stoplight to the next stoplight. There could be one on this corner, totally different brand of a mini-mart on another corner. They're everywhere now. But back then, this was the only one, for a couple miles around. It wasn't like today where there's one on every corner. So the locals would hang out there and just catch up on news, what's going on in the little community, all that kind of stuff. It was like a public gathering place, as well as selling on the stuff that we sold. And we sold milk, of course, a lot of dairy products and all. Part of my job was to restock the coolers and the freezers, because there was some ice cream in the freezer. So like 1 or 2 doors of freezer section, and maybe 4 doors of coolers, which were for the milk, of course, and all that kind of stuff. But there was some sodas and stuff in there too. When you went in through a door here and went behind the coolers and the freezers, go in there, and there were crates that the dairy would deliver, these crates of milk and the ice cream and everything else. Of course, when you're working inside the freezer restocking it, good idea to have a jacket handy. We always had those hanging there to go into the freezer. Another thing we kept in the freezer was soft pretzels. Soft pretzels are huge in this piece of the country. They would come in frozen as well, and then we would thaw them out. So if I'm working that day at the cash register, I would go to the freezer, get a bag of these soft pretzels, and sit them to thaw. So I always had a good stock of pretzels for the people also. Another thing we sold was subs. There was a little section with a glass display for lunch meat and cheese and stuff like that. It was part of my job to make sure I cut up enough lunch meat and cheese to make the subs that we sold. Because a lot of people, even regular Monday through Friday, would stop in at lunchtime. They would get their sub and a bag of chips and a tea or something at their lunch break, and then that would be how they had their lunch. Most of the working people would just stop by. Another thing that we had for lunches was the hot dogs. So I always kept the hot dogs on a roller also, so they could grab a hot dog instead of a sub or something like that, depending on what they wanted for lunch. Lunch was big though. No gas pumps. There were no gas pumps at this mini-mart. Like I said, it wasn't like today where these big chains of mini markets also have, 10 or 12 gas pumps outside. You didn't see that back then. Now, later in time, a lot later, they ended up demolishing the small store where I was working, and on the same property built a bigger store and had gas pumps. So today they have a few gas pumps anyway, but they didn't back then. And this was a time too before scanners and stuff. When I worked there was this big clunky cash register where people would bring something up and everything would be marked separately. So say they bought a sub and some chips. Well, I knew the sub was, say, a $1 for the sub. Enter that in the keys and stuff, and it would totalize the numbers on the screen. Yeah, the little toggles that would flop up. That was the screen back then. No scanners. It wasn't like you just scan the thing and off you go like it is today. People back then, when they saw the entered numbers totaling up, they would just give me cash. So if it, $3, whatever, I would give them their change. 99% of the stuff back then was cash. that's the way it was at the Mini-mart back then when I was making a whopping $2.50 an hour. But things were a little cheaper back then too. It really was a gathering place where the community would come, they would hang out at the store. I don't think, well, I never see people hanging out at a convenience store today. They probably throw you out. But back then, they hung out there talking. And it did make work go faster as well for me. So until the next time, take care of yourself, and I'll see you later.